this lesson, we are going to look at the interface of Blender. So as you can see here, I am using Blender version 3.2, but you should be able to follow along in any other version that's pretty similar or close to this version. So first of all, when you open up Blender, you will see the 3D viewport. This is this big window right here. And this is basically where most of the work in Blender will happen. This is where you will do the modeling and the animation. And basically most of the work will happen in this 3D viewport. And as you can see, we've got this red line and then we've got this green line going across this grid. So these are the axes. So the red axis, you can see in the corner, we've got a red X there. So that's the X axis. And then you've got the green, which is the Y axis. Then there's also a Z axis, but that's currently hidden as we don't really need to see that in the 3D viewport. You can actually enable it here at the top. If you click on this little drop down here for the viewport overlays, you can enable the Z axis as well, but we're not going to worry about that for now. So just know that this is the 3D viewport where basically most of the things in Blender will happen. Now, if we look to the left hand side, these are the tools available in this layout or in this 3D viewport. And then on the right hand side, you've got the axes and you've got some icons here that we will look at later as well. Then right at the top of the interface, you've got these different workspaces: layout, modeling, sculpting, UV editing, texture painting, shading, animation, rendering, compositing, geometry nodes, scripting, and then you even have a few extras if you click on this little plus. So these are basically just different workspaces that are customized for specific workflows inside of Blender. So we're going to look at them a little bit later. So then if we move over to the right hand side, you'll see this box here in the right top corner. This is the outliner. The outliner basically shows everything that is going on in your scene, or all the objects and cameras and lights, etc. that's in your scene. So you can quickly just use the outliner to see everything in your scene really easily. The outliner is also used to organize your scene. So you can go in here and I can say double click on this cube and I can rename it to maybe say box 1 or anything that you want to rename that object to. And as you see, if I click on this box, it will actually select that object in the 3D viewport as well. The same if I click on the camera, it's going to select the camera, or if I click on the light, it's going to select the light. You can also click these objects in the 3D viewport directly. So if I just click on the box or click on the camera or click on the light, it's basically doing the same thing. So you can also rename your lights in the outliner. So I can double click and I can call this my light number 1 or anything you like. And same with the camera. So I can call this maybe camera 01. So just know that the outliner is basically the place where you can organize your scene. And later on, we will look at a few different things that you can do here to organize your scene a little better. One thing about the outliner that's very important is try and rename your objects to keep everything nice and organized. Because if you're going to have a lot of objects in your scene, maybe you have a couple of cubes and different objects, it's going to get very confusing if you don't rename them correctly in this outliner. It's just going to make your life easier if you actually rename those items. And then it will just make everything easier if you come back to that project later on and you have to figure out what is what. So that's the outliner. So right below the outliner, we've got the properties window. Now the properties window consists of all these different tabs that you can click on, and we're going to go through all of these or most of these in a later lesson, but just know for now that this is the properties area, and this is where we can change things like the render settings or your scene settings or the world settings or object properties you can find here, and different things that we're going to look at later on. So just know that this area is the properties window. Next, if you look at the bottom of the interface, you'll see the timeline. Now I can click and drag to make this timeline a little bit bigger. And this is basically where you can see the frame range or the frames of your animation. So you'll basically use the timeline when doing any types of animation. So I can click and drag this playhead to change what frame I'm currently seeing, and you can see the number of the specific frame that we're on. Let's say if I put this on frame 100, you can see that this number will update as well. This is the current frame we are on. So I can click here and I can type in, say, 1, press enter, and that's going to jump to the first frame in our animation. You can also set your duration or the frames, the number of frames here. So I can set the start and the end. So let's say I want my animation to only be 100 frames. I can set the end to 100 frames. And now you can see that it will update this area here at the bottom to only have 100 frames. Here you also find your play buttons. So you've got your play forward or play animation, and then you also have your play animation backwards. So I can click on this play button and you can see that the play, it will play through that animation, and it's going to loop when it gets to our end frame, which is 100. I can also stop that and go backwards, and that's going to play the animation in reverse. So that's basically all you have to know about the timeline for now. So we're going to get back to that in a later lesson as well. So you can resize all of these windows. You can just click and drag and resize them as you want. You can also very easily customize the interface in Blender, but for now we're just going to leave it on this default configuration. Then right at the top here of the interface, you've got your normal file, edit, render window, and help. So under file, you will find your save or save as. So this is where you can save your project. If you click on save as, you can specify a new project name. And once you have set a file name for the project, you can just click file and save, and that's going to save your project. Or you can just use the shortcut. On a Mac, it's Command S or Control S if you're on a PC. So this is where you'll find all of those. You can also use this file menu to create a new project, or you can open an existing project, things like that. You can also do the import and export commands here, but we're not going to go into that for now. Then we've got our edit menu. This is where you find the Blender preferences that we will probably look at in a later lesson. And you've got your render menu right here, window, and also the help, where you can find tutorials, the Blender manual, and just some support websites that you can use. So let's have a look at this top area in the 3D viewport. So we talked about these two icons. So the first one is your gizmo. So I can switch that off or on, and this will actually hide all these little gizmos on the side. You can also click this drop down menu to specify which gizmos you want to see. But yeah, don't worry too much about that for now. Next to that, we've got the overlays or the show overlays. Now, if I click on this, it will disable all the overlays like the grid and all the little overlays that you see in the 3D viewport. Let's click that again to enable it, and then click on the little drop down next to it. And here you can customize the viewport exactly as you want it. As you can see here, we've got our x-axis and y-axis. These are the green and red lines in the 3D viewport. And as I said before, you can also enable the z-axis. That's this blue line right here. But usually we don't need to see the z-axis because we know that's up and down. Then you can also enable or disable things like statistics, which is nice. If I enable this, you'll see a little statistics here on the side, which will give you an overview of the amount of objects, vertices, edges, and faces and triangles and so on in the scene. So we'll probably use this a little bit later, so you can switch this off for now. And you can enable different things here. You can change the geometry to be wireframe or to show wireframe on top of your mesh, but let's leave that off for now. So let's have a look at these icons right here at the top. These are the different shading views or render previews that you can choose for the viewport. So the first little sphere, if I click on this, this will give you a wireframe view of all the objects in the scene. As you can see, the cube now turned to a wireframe, and that's if you want to use wireframe for some reason. If you want to do editing and you want to see the vertices and the edges behind the object, you can use that. You can also enable this little icon, which is the X-ray view. So if I disable this, you'll see that we still see the object as a wireframe, but we can't see the vertices and the edges behind our object. But if I enable X-ray, you can actually see through the object. Okay, the next shading view is solid mode, or the solid shading mode. So as you can see, we get a solid render view, and this is probably the render mode that you will use mostly inside of Blender. Whenever you're doing any 3D modeling or any animation work, you will be in this shading mode. This mode is very fast, so it will not slow down your viewport, because it's just giving you like a kind of very rough shaded view of your objects. Next, we have the material preview mode, this little sphere right there. Now this one will show you your materials. So in a later lesson, we will look at the materials, applying different textures and materials to your objects, and this render mode will give you, or will show you, how those materials will look inside of the viewport. And the last one is the render preview. Now the render preview will show your lights and your materials and kind of everything that you've set up. And you can also change between two render engines inside of Blender. There's a Eevee render, which is a real-time renderer, and then there's also the Cycles renderer, which is an unbiased, realistic or photorealistic renderer, which is a lot slower than Eevee, but it's going to give you much better results. So there is a lesson later on in this course that we're going to talk about the different renderers and how they work, so don't worry too much about that for now. Just know that you have your different render modes for the 3D viewport right up here. So for now, I'm going to switch to solid mode. That's probably the one that you want to be on for most of the time. And then there's one more thing I want to show you before we end this lesson. If you hover your mouse in this 3D viewport area and you press N for November on the keyboard, you can toggle this side menu. Now, more on this also later, but just know that you've got this N side menu right here. And if let's say if I click on my cube, you can see that it will show all those details that corresponds to this object. So I've got the location, I've got the rotation, the scale, and you can also toggle between some of these other tabs. Now you might not see like a 3D print one there, or maybe some of these other ones, because I've added some or installed some add-ons, but for now just know that you can press N to open this side menu. Alright, so that is basically the interface inside of Blender. I will see you in the next lesson.